I present the people's gavel to the Speaker of the House, John Boehner.
So if you've come here to see your name in the lights or to pass off a political victory as some accomplishment, you've come to the wrong place. You come here humbled by the opportunity to serve. If you've come here to be the determined voice of the people, then you've come to the right place.
Speaker John Boehner getting a little emotional after accepting the gavel after a surprisingly close vote. One of the things we're going to talk about this morning on our roundtable, joined by George Will. Happy New Year to you. Gwen Ifill of PBS, ABC's new chief White House correspondent, Jonathan Karl, Greta Van Susteren of Fox News, former Labor Secretary Bob Reich, and now the Chancellor's Professor at UCal Berkeley. Thanks all for coming in. We got to start out with this detail. I think, George, it was the first time that Congress was in on January 1st since the Korean War. And you say the deal, and this is kind of a contrarian view, was actually a triumph.
In this sense, I think people will look back on this deal as where liberalism passed an apogee and went into decline for the following reason. The Bush tax rates were passed in two tranches, 2001 and 2003. In 2001, only 28 Democratic members of the House voted for them. In 2003, only 7 did. And they did it for only 10 years. They were to expire. Under this deal, 172 House Democrats voted to make the Bush rates permanent for all but 0.5% of American taxpayers. What that means is that they can no longer tax the middle class. And we have here an endangered species. They're about...
He's pointing to me. I don't know why.
I'll tell you why. There are only about 3 liberals in the country, and you're one, who aren't actively hostile to arithmetic. And therefore, you know that you cannot fund the state that liberals want, the entitlement state, without taxing the middle class at least. And now you've given up that with the locking in as permanent law the Bush tax rates. That's off the table.
Well, let me first of all say in a slightly more nonpartisan approach. I think that the problem really with the deal is that what we needed most from an economic standpoint is, number one, a stimulus in the short term, number two, serious deficit reduction in the long term, and number three, some stability and some certainty about the future. And we got none of this. And that really is a major problem. We are going to be up against continuous trench warfare, and we have not dealt really at all with the deficit, the long-term deficit problem. And in the short term, we've got a huge employment issue. I mean, jobs should be the #1 issue right now in the country. It still is. We saw that unemployment report. It still is a terrible jobs picture, and yet we have virtually no stimulus. In fact, Social Security taxes are going up.
And John, Karl, clear from when I was talking to Senator McConnell that even though he doesn't want to accept the possibility of another massive confrontation over the debt limit in February, that it's coming. The divisions are as wide as they ever were.
We are absolutely on a collision course. You have this amazing situation, George, where the White House is saying they will not negotiate on the issue of the debt limit. That's just something Congress has to do, period. No negotiations. They're not scheduling meetings on it. It's not going to happen. And the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, is now saying he's through with negotiations, that they're going to go through, they're going to pass in the House what they're going to do and move on, but there are going to be none of this.
So Mitch McConnell's talking to himself.
Yes, so Mitch McConnell is basically talking to himself.
And so is President Obama, because President Obama came out and said, I believe that there are loopholes which still must be closed, other basically fees and taxes which still can be raised. And you heard the Senate minority leader, Mr. McConnell, say, oh, no, we're done with taxes. Taxes are off the table. So there is a collision coming, and it's coming really soon. I'm not sure anybody has the appetite for it.
And it shows that everyone there are really no success stories in this. Everyone was a big, fat loser. It's disgusting. From the White House on down, this whole fiscal cliff resolution that took 18 months to get to where we were. Even Simpson Bowles said it was a missed opportunity. And you talk about we need some short-term stimulus. Actually, there was short-term stimulus in this fiscal bill. Goldman Sachs, NASCAR, Hollywood, they all got some short-term stimulus.
Those tax extenders.
Yeah. So why do they get the short-term stimulus? And so the big losers
the Puerto Rican rum industry.
Right, and so the big losers are, is from top down. I blame the White House, I blame Capitol Hill, and the American people saw how the sausage is made, and once again, they were had again because they don't do their work, and all they do is take advantage of the American people.
Don't neglect electric scooters, because this really tells you how Washington works. The fiscal cliff deal, scooters are made in Oregon. Senator Wyden of Oregon said it is unfair that the federal government uses tax credits to bribe people to buy electric cars. That's discrimination. Therefore, we ought to have a tax credit to bribe people to buy electric scooters, which we now do.
Yeah, but the point is that this fiscal cliff is a big, fat lie. It did have some stimulus for its special interests, its little sort of, its pets, its Congresses and the White House's pets, and that's disgraceful. And they didn't do their job. They've known about this for a long time. If you don't do your job, you don't do your job, none of us, we'd be out of jobs. And instead, and the media lets them off the hook saying that's the way it's always done. Well, maybe it should stop being done that way.
The real question, the practical question is, what are they going to do now, faced with not only another fiscal cliff, but also this debt ceiling? I mean, I think that the showdown over the debt ceiling could be much, much worse than anything we've seen so far, because they're just dug in. Both sides are dug in.
George, there does seem to be a division inside the Republican Party right now. You do have some voices saying, that phrase the Wall Street Journal used, shoot the hostage. You should be willing to shoot the hostage, go over and default if you have to. Senator Cornyn calling about a partial government shutdown. Others like Newt Gingrich saying that would be crazy. That is a losing strategy.
Well, first of all, the default itself doesn't scare some people, because the big loser in the conflict last August was Standard & Poor's. Standard & Poor's said, we are appalled and we're going to lower your credit rating. They did, and the money flowed in, not out of this. We're borrowing today at about 40% less cost than we were before our debt was downgraded.
But don't you think default will be different?
Well, default, the question is, do you have to default? Pat Toomey says, look, our interest charges are about $300 billion a year. Our tax revenues are 10 times that much. We can pay the interest charges if we prioritize and don't pay something else.
Meanwhile, John Karl, some Democrats on Capitol Hill, the president says he's not going to do it, say he should go to the 14th Amendment and simply not allow the United States to default and keep on borrowing.
And it's hard to imagine that they're not going to be tempted to look at that again, given how
even though they've ruled
adamant
it out so far.
They have ruled it out. The White House has said they are not going to do this, that Congress must act on this. But they are saying no negotiations on this. I would say on Standard & Poor's, it's interesting to look at what their guidance is now. They're saying the risk is not that Congress won't act to raise the debt limit. They're saying the risk is that Congress may undermine what little deficit reduction is already put in place. They're worried about the underlying problem, which is that we have an exploding deficit problem.
And American people are worried about an underlying problem, too. We just heard Mitch McConnell say something everyone can agree with, which is, it's beyond me how we got to this point, where we were right at this deadline on New Year's Eve. The president has said, it's beyond me that people can't just do their jobs. And American people are saying, it's beyond me that they were there doing this. What? That is the underlying question.
But didn't the American people vote for it? If you look at that, and let me bring this to you, Greta, again. Susteren, I mean, that's what they voted for. You voted for a lot of people believe this is not going to get solved until either Republicans win the White House or Democrats take control of the House.
Well, maybe the strategy shouldn't be how do you win. Maybe the strategy should be how do you have sort of a sense of decency in your job and responsibility. Maybe they shouldn't take the long vacations that they do. I mean, look at the debt ceiling. August 2011 is when they set the sequestration. The super committee didn't make a decision by November. So what did they do? They did absolutely nothing. Nothing. December, January, February, going all the way up to August. They all took the month off in August. Then in September, they all started campaigning, and we paid their salaries to campaign. Maybe they ought to have a personal sense of decency and stop worrying about winning and trying to at least begin thinking about solving it.
Look, George, I think that the only way that the president can win on the debt ceiling is by mobilizing the business community, mobilizing Wall Street, putting huge pressure on Republicans in Congress right now. And it's got to be done right now. It can't wait. The economy really will suffer if we go right up to that deadline, because that's not like the fiscal cliff. We're talking about the full faith and credit of the United States.
And if that doesn't work, Bob, I mean, does the president really, can he really sustain this notion that he's not going to negotiate?
And he can't. That's why he needs Wall Street and the business community behind him saying, don't jeopardize the full faith and credit of the United States. It is an abuse of power to subject the United States to that kind of potential danger.
But how much negotiating is he doing? Last week, he had to outsource it to Vice President Biden because he doesn't have the relationships. He hasn't spent the years, whether as president or senator, developing the relationships so he can negotiate. He actually had to outsource it to Vice President Biden to go up to see his old friend, Senator McConnell. I mean, Washington is so dysfunctional. The people
But what negotiations start with someone saying, okay, I'll give you this? They never start that way. They start with, this is my line. And that's where you begin to talk.
But you've got to trust each other. In order to negotiate, you have to have some sense of trust. It hasn't just to be about winning. And there's absolutely no effort.
But it can't just be leaders, it has to be followers. And that's why I want to come to John Karl. On this, Speaker Boehner couldn't move his caucus along. And you were on the floor during the vote for his new speakership, and it was a lot closer than anyone really expected.
Look, there were only 12 Republicans who did not support him, right? But it was incredibly dramatic because 17 was the number. They would force it to go to another ballot, and then who knows what would happen. And there was a moment during that vote, as I was watching it on the floor, where there were more than 17 that were still out there. Some that let their names go by without voting the first time. And you could see the speaker's staff on the floor. You could see the staff for the whip, McCarthy, on the floor, keeping vote tallies. I'm worried this was going to go the wrong way. This was a real shot across the bow.
And those House Republicans who are worried about Speaker Boehner did not vote for the deal, are doing exactly what they believe their constituents elected them to do.
They are dissenting from the great American consensus. I again think the journalistic narrative about Washington today is 180 degrees wrong. The problem in the country is a consensus that is broad. Republicans subscribe to it too, which is that we should have a large, generous welfare state and not pay for it. That's the point about extending all the Bush tax rates for all except 0.5% of the country, is that we have now put off limits the source of money in this country, which is the middle class, so we're not going to pay for the welfare state.
I think,
but they're coming back for more tax increases.
That narrative is fundamentally wrong. I think what the public does not fully grasp is that it's healthcare costs in the future combined with aging baby boomers that are driving these out-year deficits. It is not Social Security. It is not Medicare and Medicaid. It is the underlying dysfunctionality of our healthcare system, and the Affordable Care Act did not do enough to control long-term healthcare costs. That's what everybody in Washington ought to be focusing on right now.
But 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we're going to see two big changes in American life. Much more reliance on private savings and means testing of entitlement programs. I don't care who's president. I don't care who runs Congress. We're going to have both of those.
And as early as tomorrow, we're likely to see a new nominee. I'm going to switch subjects right now for Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. The White House saying the phone call has not been made to former Senator Hagel yet, but it is almost certain to happen. And one of the things we've seen, Gwen Ifill, right here is an extraordinary amount of politicking before an appointment is made, trying to force the president to change his mind.
There are so many trial balloons floating around. It like blocks the sun at this point. We saw a trial balloon for Secretary of State. We've seen trial balloons for Chief of Staff. We've seen trial balloons for Treasury Secretary, even though it looks like it's going to be the same people we hear all along. And what I don't understand about the trial balloons is why you don't just pull the trigger and do something about it. In this case, that did not happen with Susan Rice. That has not happened with other nominees, partly because of the distraction of this this fiscal cliff debate. But I think in the case of Senator Hagel, with everyone coming from different sides, the left and the right and the pro-Israel caucus and you name it, coming down on him, gay rights supporters, all coming down on him at once, the White House sounds like they're now prepared to actually do something about it and make people put their money where their mouth is. You saw Senator McConnell, who's praised Chuck Hagel in the past, suddenly saying, well, let's wait and see. We saw Chuck Schumer, who's praised him in the past, saying, let's wait and see.
Well, Chuck Schumer, that's important. A Democrat, and that's because there's so much concern among these people who've raised the questions that they say that Chuck Hagel is not sufficiently pro-Israel. There's already been an ad against him. We'll get this from the Emergency Committee for Israel.
And while President Obama says all options are on the table for preventing a nuclear Iran, Hagel says military action is not a viable, feasible, responsible option. President Obama, for Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel is not a responsible option.
John, Karl, that's caused some concern among Democrats as well, as Gwen mentioned, Chuck Schumer. So I guess it gets to the question is why is the president so determined to go forward with this?
Well, he thinks he's the right guy for the job. He thinks having an enlisted Vietnam veteran running the Pentagon who agreed with him when it came to Iraq and on Afghanistan, he's the right guy to do it. But I've got to tell you, there's going to be a big problem in the Senate on this. I mean, I talked this morning to top Democratic staffer in the Senate who said this is not a guarantee that he will get confirmed, that there are enough Democrats that are concerned about Hagel to put him well short of 50 until he makes the case. I mean, I think ultimately he gets confirmed, but this will be a real battle in the Senate.
There is a puzzle here. With all of the fights that the president has coming up, why is he doing this? I mean, there are a lot of other people he could be putting up, but why is he expending political capital in this way?
Well,
I don't understand.
He didn't want to see his two top picks for national security jobs
didn't they say the
to
same
go
thing?
down. He already gave up on Susan Rice. He wasn't going to give up on his second.
He's also a Republican. Let's not forget that.
Well,
that also is some up to a
I think
point.
that was the original intention.
Right, that was the original intention. But look, I mean, the guy's the president gets to choose. and he's going to have a hearing. He's going to answer all the questions, and without all of us sort of, poking at him and all of his critics coming out and running ads against him, I'd sort of like to hear what he has to say.
The fight doesn't begin until the nomination is actually made. All this pre-fight is fun to watch, but in the end, these guys have to show up, take their questions, get his answers, and vote or not vote, and decide whether it's worth it to them to expend the political capital to go against the president.
There was a big difference with the Susan Rice case. That battle didn't make it. He didn't even get nominated. But in this case, the White House has been much more aggressive in defending Hagel even before the pick was made.
It is an odd pick, first of all, because if you pick a Republican, a Democrat picks a Republican, he ought to be someone who thinks like Republicans and is liked by Republicans, and neither of those are true in this case. Furthermore, he doesn't think the way the president thinks, or at least the way the president talks about Iran and sanctions and negotiating with Hamas and all the rest, and gays in the military, all that stuff.
He's in line with the president on Iran. I mean, they both believe that you should try negotiations, that the military should be a last resort. He's saying it's not irresponsible to talk about a military option right now.
I think what he says is it's a last resort and fundamentally a disastrous resort, and the way he describes it is it's so disastrous it's not a realistic resort, which may be right. I disagree with him on a lot of stuff, but I think he should be confirmed and will be, because vast deference is owed to presidents in cabinet members for two reasons. Their job is to carry out the president's wishes, and B, they leave when the president leaves, which is why more deference is owed to that than, say, on Supreme Court now.
One leaving before the president.
I would love to quote you on that, George. But he will, at the end of the day, he'll get through. I can't imagine a Republican Senate, the Republican senators rejecting a former Republican senator. But there will be blood on the
most of them are going to vote against
but there'll be enough votes there, George.
I don't disagree.
There'll be blood on the floor, and that's the why do it? I mean, that's the question.
Because at some point you have to put some blood on the floor if you say you believe in things.
But there's going to be so much blood on the floor with regard to the fiscal cliff and so many other issues that are coming up the debt ceiling.
So what's
another member of the president's cabinet is leaving this month. The Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. We saw this week a real health scare. She was hospitalized for a blood clot after so many questions, and I'm going to bring this to you, Greta, after we show some of it on Fox News about whether or not she was really sick.
When you don't want to go to a meeting or a conference or an event, you have a diplomatic illness.
I'm not a doctor, but it seems as though that the Secretary of State has come down with a case of Benghazi flu.
Immaculate concussion, because it's like it's a tree falls in the forest. Does it really fall if nobody hears it falls? Did she really have a concussion?
Greta, you're not part of this in any way. You do not question her illness. But can you help explain what's behind all of these questions?
I mean, I don't get behind any. I mean, I'm responsible for what I say, number one. Those were all very dated before she was hospitalized, and there was not much information coming out of the State Department and very early on with those quotes. Look, not for 1 second did I doubt it. Once that these people heard that she was seriously ill, that all changed. The Secretary of State will have to, I think, should answer questions about Benghazi. There's a lot of mystery, and 4 people were murdered. If there are 4 people murdered in Washington that were unsolved, we'd still be asking questions to this day. Look, she was very sick, and when the State Department came out with more information, you saw all that stop. So I have nothing beyond to say that.
Look, I've known Hillary for decades. She is a workhorse. She works harder than anybody I know.
And I've traveled with her. I've traveled with her. I've actually seen it. And anybody who's traveled with her has seen that.
And that's, she's traveled to more countries than any former Secretary
of State. And she's not shied away from a fight either.
And she hasn't. I mean, I think that...
Which is why she has said she's going to come back and testify on Benghazi before the Senate. So,
and that'll probably be the last thing. She will not travel, and that'll be one of the last things she has to do. Meanwhile, the other big thing coming up this year, gun control coming out of Sandy Hook. We heard Senator McConnell right there saying, George Will, that this must follow all of the debates, the fiscal cliff debates we're going to be having over the next 3 months.
Well, the president can, through his allies, control what comes before Congress, so I don't think Mitch McConnell can stop this. There are 2 questions. First of all, the president ought to look, first of all, at his home city of Chicago and talk to his former friend, and still friend, I guess, Chief of Staff.
Former Chief of Staff, still friend, yeah.
Right. Where they've had more than 500 murders in Chicago last year, most of them gun violence, and see if gun control has anything to do with that. George, my feeling about gun control policy is a little bit like climate control policy. It's been well said that the only policy question about climate change is how much money do you want to spend on climate change to have no effect, discernible effect on the climate. And the same is true with gun control. I do not see how you can write a law that will have much effect on what they're experiencing, for example, in Chicago.
You know, we should take a look a little bit more at ourselves from top to bottom. I mean, we have so much violence surrounding us that we think is okay. When we go to the movies, we see it's okay. Obviously, you can't legislate against things like that. Even the President of the United States has rappers to the White House who say horrible things. Nobody's scandalized. I mean, there's no sort of effort for us to start look at ourselves and how we're numb to violence in our culture.
I'm trying to figure out whether any rappers have resulted in the deaths of school children. I don't
No,
think
I don't
so.
think it's all school children. There were 2 firefighters that were murdered on December 24th. They weren't school children. This has put a highlight on the problem.
But as George points out, every weekend there are people killed on street corners in Chicago. And if you look back over the president's statements about gun violence in the wake of Newtown, and you look at what people like Secretary Arne Duncan have had to say, they always talk about the broader idea of violence, not just about guns. And so that what's on the table right now for Vice President Biden, the people who are trying to figure out what to do, is a wide range of issues. Some of it having to do with gun control, some of it have to do with speaking to gun violence. That's the only way you're going to get the attention. But what happens most of the time in Washington is these things come up and then they fade after the shock.
I don't think Washington can necessarily answer the question for the nation. What I'm trying to point out is that we all have to look at ourselves as well and look at what we do. Even like that PSA that Hollywood artists put out for gun control the other day, and then side by side some group put all the violent movies they're in. I mean, this is a big discussion, a big national narrative that we all have to look at ourselves in terms of how our culture has now become to accept violence as an answer to problems, as a solution to problems. We see that on TV and movies all over.
Greta is undoubtedly correct. But the fact remains that the murder of 20 first graders has touched the nation in ways that I don't remember the nation being touched. I don't think this is going to go away. The NRA's technique in the past has been to really rely on the attention deficit disorder of America. Basically lay low until attention is no longer placed on this. But we are having now a national discussion of a sort that we have had to have.
And John, I think Bob's right about how there was an initial spike in attention and concern right after Sandy Hook, but it does seem to have subsided just a bit according to the most recent polls, and that's why the White House knows that speed matters here. They're going to have to move quickly.
Speed matters. I mean, I think that there was a moment right after Sandy Hook where you could see some movement for the first real gun control legislation to pass in some 20 years.
Among Democrats.
Among Democrats who were strong supporters of the NRA. But I've got to say,
just heard Senator Heitkamp didn't seem all too enthusiastic about moving forward on gun control.
And it's not going to happen soon, right? Because there's no way Congress is going to think about anything along those lines until we're done with the fiscal cliff mess, the debt ceiling, the funding of the government. We're at least 2 or 3 months away before this can even be considered. And that's a lot of time. I mean, we do have attention deficit disorder, and I think that it's going to be a real challenge to get any gun control legislation passed.
That's the real tragedy. I mean, the children was unbelievable. It drew all of our attention. But 2 firefighters trying to probably save lives on Christmas Eve. I did criminal defense work for years. I've been to murder scenes. I've seen this stuff. This violence. You talk about the Chicago schools. It is horrible. I mean, the Chicago violence. A lot of it was in schools.
It's 25 Sandy Hooks in 1 year.
And so when are we going to have this national narrative? Not just. I mean, we've got to look at all communities and see what's going on in all communities, and we've got to stop being so numb to the violence that surrounds it. We just say, oh, okay.
Real quickly, how many of you think that there's going to be a serious package of reforms passed by Congress this year?
On guns? I think it's as likely as a serious package on immigration reform and energy and climate change and all the other things the president has set high on his list.
I think it will happen, George, if the president gets behind it, gets chiefs of police, mayors, mobilizes the public and the people who are likely to be supporters of it.
Well, define serious. If by serious you mean makes a difference in gun violence, no. But some laws will be passed.